Welcome to the Providence College Podcast. Subscribe to the show on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Google Play. If you like what you hear, please review and share with others. Email podcast@providence.edu with questions or comments. Go Friars.
Welcome to the Providence College Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Chittum, and I'm joined, as always, by PC producer and videographer Chris Judge, class of 05. Here at the Providence College Podcast, it's our job to bring you interesting stories from members of the Friar family. And today we are here with author Paul Tremblay. Paul is the author of novels Disappearance at Devil's Rock, A Head Full of Ghosts, The Little Sleep, No Sleep Till Wonderland, Swallowing a Donkey's Eye, and A Floating Boy and a Girl Who Couldn't Fly. In addition, his fiction and essays have appeared in the Los Angeles Times, Supernatural Noir, and numerous years' best anthologies. He has a master's degree in mathematics, teaches AP Calculus, and in fact once made 27 three-pointers in a row. Paul, thanks for joining us.
Sure, thanks for having me. Man, I'm busy. And thanks for the great parking spot. I don't think I've ever gotten such a good parking spot on the PC campus before as I have for today's podcast.
I think the key is coming after the last admissions tour and coming in the summer.
Yeah.
So if you come after 3 p.m. in the summer, you got a good shot.
Yeah.
But I have no doubt your parking spot today was better than mine when I came into work this morning. That's for sure. And we're taping this on August 9th. And we're kind of in the throes of the summer. And actually, summer classes just finished up. So people who are here for the summer, they finished up the end of last week. So this is probably the most barren the college campus will get.
All right. Well, and people need a break.
Yeah, there you go. And speaking of break, you never seem to get one. I mean, right? I mean, you have kind of like two full-time jobs going on. You're an AP Calculus teacher.
Right.
And I guess, would you call it a full-time writer? I mean, you obviously produce a lot of work. But how would you classify that?
No, certainly. I mean, it is a lot of work, and it's funny, I get asked fairly frequently, how do you juggle both? And sometimes my glib answer is I'm not sure. And if I do think of it sort of in the big picture term, it can be a little bit overwhelming. So I tend to focus on the day-to-day, just try to squeeze in. When I'm working on a draft, normally I'll try to squeeze in an hour or two a day. If it gets closer to the end, when I'm really excited about almost finishing it, then, maybe I can get more hours in. It's also very seasonal with me. Spring and summer, I have a lot more time to focus on writing. The fall and winter, it's more difficult too because of school responsibilities that include coaching as well. But I don't know, I've been doing it for so long, I feel like I've got the rhythms down and I sort of know, there's a comfort level in knowing what I can or can't get done in certain amounts of time. And it's also just me being able to say no. Like I'm in a fortunate place where I get asked to write short stories for anthologies quite frequently. And I've learned to have to say no, even though they sound really cool, because I know I wouldn't be able to get certain things done.
Right. So what do you coach?
So I've been coaching the 8th grade football team, which is sort of funny, in the JV high school basketball team.
At what schools?
At St. Sebastian. So, usually most of the faculty teach one or two sports or coach one or two sports as well as, they're teaching.
Got it. So you're just a busy guy, and so you do the basketball stuff. So you show off your 3-point prowess in the middle of practice, show them how to play.
Yeah, I do. It's the one thing I'm obnoxious about. I will have like an actual attitude or ego is my ability to shoot. I'm a very good outside shooter. I will not like pull punches on that.
I love it. I'm a basketball guy. I played as well, and it's I can relate to that. I used to coach a year in high school here at LaSalle Academy in Providence. But yeah, I definitely had to hold myself back from trying to jump into the games.
Yeah, now I'm getting older, jumping into the games is more painful. I can stand there and just shoot to show off that part of it. But yeah, the moving and the playing of the defenses, that's all slowed down quite a bit.
Right. Well, I want to go into kind of the schedule you have from a writing perspective, because I do think that's interesting. But before we get there, I love to just kind of rewind and go back to your time here at PC.
Yeah.
There was an interesting an article or story you put out kind of about your entree into kind of the literary world, which was great. And you talked about kind of how you read and digested a story. Where are you going? Where have you been?
Yeah.
So could you just recount that for us here?
Sure. I was a double major here, mathematics and humanities, and it was sort of like a strange, I won't get into because you don't need to know, like a weird way how I got into mathematics and humanities. But basically, second semester senior year, I finally took an English class. Most of my other humanities classes were like philosophy or history or music. Yeah, so I took basically English Lit 101. But the teacher, Professor McLaughlin, who I've been unable to track down. If anyone out there listening can help me find him, I would love to just drop him an email to say hi. But when I took that class, it was just so much fun. And he was such a great teacher. The kind of teacher that knew how to connect with students. At the time, and I still am, a big punk music fan. And he figured that out pretty early in the class because I would refer to it. And it was just a way for me and him to engage and really get me excited about the material that we were reading. But I'll never forget reading the story you mentioned, Joyce Carol Oates' Where Are You Going, Where Are You Been? It's such a great story. And I remember reading it and thinking, oh, I didn't know people wrote stuff like this. Because I wasn't a big reader for pleasure at the time. I read for high school, what was assigned. I was a good student in that way. And also T.C. Boyle's Greasy Lake. And I remember the paper that I wrote for that class, comparing sort of the use of violence in those stories. And I don't know, it just really excited me. And then, shortly after that class, I graduated. I was dating Lisa Carroll, whose name is now Lisa Carol Tremblay, PC grad 93. And I went to the hinterlands of Vermont for 2 years to get my math degree. But while I was there, struggling to get my math degree, I just read all the books that I could get my hands on.
So what do you think prompted you to go from, all right, this was an interesting story I read, and it was nice at the time, to then take that and then do a complete deep dive on that subject? Because all of us have come into contact with something that we found to be interesting, but then a day later, you move on to the next thing. What made it stick for you? Well,
Lisa played a huge role in that because she was an English major. And I remember I used to make fun of her as the math majors. Like, oh, you English majors, you just make it all up as you go. Math majors, we find the answers. It's funny how our lives have sort of switched because she's a marketing director at Papagino. So she actually has to deal with real numbers and, budgets and all that stuff. But anyway, I took that class and I'm sure I was telling her about how much I was enjoying it. And my birthday's in the summer, and for my 21st birthday, after I graduated, she bought me Stephen King's The Stand. And I just adored it. It was, such an amazing experience. And then after I read The Stand, I just got every book of his that I could get and read those. And I moved on to authors like, Peter Straub and Shirley Jackson and Kurt Vonnegut. And really, for 2 years in Vermont, it was tough because Lisa was living in Boston, so there wasn't, being a graduate student compared to an undergraduate, it's a very different, almost lonely experience because, you're not hanging out as much as you are as an undergrad. And I didn't have a car, so I was just sitting in my cold apartment reading books and occasionally doing math homework.
Sorry, so you're really immersed in the reading part at that time.
Yeah.
With an obvious goal to kind of work in the math field. I'm assuming as a teacher.
Right.
Once you get
that's
out.
What I was thinking.
Right. So then, when did writing kind of come into the picture?
It's at the same time, like when I was in Vermont, I just started playing guitar too. I think my real dream was to become a punk metal guitar player. But I quickly found out, that I'm a better writer than I am a musician.
So the master's degree in math wasn't an easy entree into the punk music scene?
No, although I went, there was a fellow student there who was like the mayor of Burlington, Vermont. He was in a band called Chin Ho that was really popular up there. So there was and he's now a PhD in math. He's a really funny guy. But yeah, for me, I don't know. So clearly there was this want for some sort of creative outlet that I hadn't quite hit on or focused on, what was the one that I wanted. I mean, I still play guitar, but just for fun. So for a little while, I was just like, okay, guitar. And then I just had this weird itch to try writing a story. I really can't explain where it came from. It was just an idea that stuck in my head and just really nagged at me until I sat down to try to write it on I'm going to age myself, an old Brother word processor. I think the screen was like 2 inches by like 10 inches. So it only fit like 2 lines of text on it.
That's like writing on a phone.
Yeah, essentially. And I lost the first half of the first story I ever wrote. It just disappeared. And I remember thinking, this is like some sort of sign. Do I give up or do I rewrite the thing? So I pushed through and rewrote it. I mean, it was a terrible, awful story. But, I wrote it and I learned from it and just sort of stuck with it from there.
So when did you start sharing your work with other people?
Almost right away. I was just excited to have a story. I showed it to Lisa. I showed it to friends and family. And in that way, they were all so very supportive. Like my first readers for the first few years that I even attempted writing were, some cousins, Lisa and some other friends. And, they would give honest feedback, which is always important. It wasn't just like a pat on the back, like, hey, this is great. They would be supportive, but they would tell me things that they thought could get better and improve, which is important for anyone who's starting out writing. You're going to want to find people who are going to be supportive, but also at the same time, mostly honest.
And you're doing this on the side. So are you taking their feedback and kind of reworking the story as you go, or taking multiple paths at different drafts and trying to perfect it? Or are you just kind of getting out whatever itch you have, creating the story, and then kind of moving on to the next one?
I'd say a little bit of both. I mean, especially in the early going, I would take their feedback and from those drafts and write the story up as best as I could, and then I'd send it out to different short story markets. So this was like, late 90s, early 2000s when I was sending out short stories, my first ones. And sometimes sometimes editors would give you feedback for why they rejected it, and sometimes they wouldn't. But whenever they did give me feedback, I sort of took it to heart and just filed it away like another lesson to take. And so I mean, probably from like 95 to, actually not 95, let's say like 97 to like 2002 or 3, I probably wrote like 50 or 60 short stories. And that's really how I learned how to write. Actually, I wrote one novel that was terrible, but again, learned, quite a bit from, learning what not to do is as important as learning, how to do it or what to do.
I can imagine. So the 6 years from 97, 6 or 7 years from 97 to 2003, how many of those short stories out of the 50 or 60 were actually published?
Probably like, let's say like 45 of the 60. I mean, and
Wow.
most of them are like in really small markets. I never gave stories away for free. I think the smallest payments I received were like $10, but still, I always started at the highest paying markets first, and worked my way down. Like if I got rejected, then I would rewrite it and, try a different market that maybe didn't pay as much. So that was important to me, especially now. I think, if I were starting out now, the temptation to, because there's so many ways you could either just self-publish something or there are markets that won't pay you anything. And, that's a tough thing to not just fall into. I mean, because I think it can be a trap sometimes, just that idea of instant gratification. And if you want instant gratification, writing is not the profession for you. I mean, it takes a lot of years, a lot of patience to do it correctly, I think. But yeah, so I mean, those early, I think it was also, it was a nice, I don't want to call it an advantage, but it was a nice thing that there was and is this vibrant speculative fiction, that we'll call that the term that sort of, it's an umbrella that holds science fiction, fantasy, and horror all together. There's a pretty vibrant small press community there. So there are, I don't want to call them practice magazines because they're not practice magazines, but there's definitely a vibrant small press where there's a lot of magazines and quite a few of them pay. And, it's a way to not only get your stories published, but it's also a way just to connect with other people who have the same writing and reading interests that you might have. So, short of just writing in the practice, another, I think, a big part of my journey was finding this group of people that I could just, get moral support from. I mean, because getting moral support from your friends and family is great, but finding other writers who are sort of struggling through the same things you're struggling through is really important as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. And you'd know that they have that unbiased feedback as opposed to a family member who, maybe either sugarcoats it or isn't telling you quite the right thing. That you
right.
Maybe telling you what they think you want to hear as opposed to what you need to hear. And when you're sending out or submitting your work to various places, how did you actually know where to submit it to? Because, you were a novice at this point. It's
right.
not like you had a built-in community in the beginning or you built it over time. So how did you just kind of jump into that pool and saying, all right, these are you mentioned you kind of went down the hierarchy of like the higher paying places and down to the bottom. How did you even know how to categorize them?
Well, I guess it was still in the early goings of the internet, or not the early goings of the internet, but before it became what it is for us now, just so ubiquitous. But there was market listings. I was able to research those. I think the first market listing I found was like Writer's Digest or something. But I was quickly able to find out the different writing markets online that they'll list. These are the magazines. These are what they pay. These are their typical response times. So I mean, especially now that information is very easy to find. No matter what genre you're working in. I think in some ways, if you're writing short stories, it's probably more difficult for straight literary markets because a lot of those seem to be magazines that are run by colleges or offshoots of MFA programs, and some of them will actually charge reading fees, which I never experienced, in the sort of the speculative fiction field that didn't necessarily rely on, the college publication model. But yeah, it's tricky. I mean, but there's so much information out there, and I think now with obviously social media, it's a lot easier now to be able to meet and talk to and find, not only the writers that you enjoy. I mean, most of those writers are on Facebook and on Twitter, but just finding sort of your own support group.
Right. So the authors that you started connecting with, were they people who were established in the field and you kind of looked up to in a way, or are they more kind of in the same kind of grind as you were, kind of trying to get their footing in this community while trying to kind of, improve their chops in a way to get them to kind of a higher level or 2 levels up from where they currently are?
I was fortunate to be able to sort of hook on with, I would say, both levels. I'd say the more day-to-day sort of people were friends who were sort of in the same boat, same experience level as I was. But at the same time, early on in my writing career, I got some support or, nice words from, there's one author named Poppy Z. Bright, for example, who had read a short story online that was published, and she, loved the story and said so publicly. And that was a real nice boon early on to have, someone who was respected like her, to write about it. And I also, when I finished a novel that I was actually happy with, that I was going to try to get an agent with, I actually faxed Stuart Onan. It's funny that his he had a fax number somewhat available online somewhere, just out of the blue. It's like, hey, I'm a big fan of your work. He's, one of the best American novelists going still. Would you consider reading this book and maybe give me a blurb? Even though I didn't have a publisher yet, my plan was to get a blurb for my book first. This is my bright idea. And then send it off to agents. And Stuart, he's such a nice, almost like stereotypically Midwestern nice guy. He's from Pennsylvania. And there was a Red Sox plot to this book that I'd written. It wasn't horror. It was just sort of a goofy comedy set in Boston. He's a huge baseball fan, so we sort of connected with that plot. But anyway, here's this big, famous author who doesn't have to give his time or be generous with his time, but he was. And I found many more times than not, other writers want other writers to succeed. There are a few here and there who aren't so great, who aren't such nice people. But most of them, in my experience, most of them have been. Most of them operate under the idea that a rising tide raises all ships. So, if one writer succeeds, it just helps the crazy publishing industry, to be more successful and hopefully, put out more good books from all sorts of people.
Right. And during that time, the late 90s, early 2000s, what were the kind of the biggest improvements you made as a writer? You look back now and read some of that work. How did you evolve?
Oh boy. You know what? I remember when I first started writing, I wore horror writer as a badge. Like every story I'm going to write is a horror story. It's funny. I've sort of come full circle on that. So I feel like the day I became a better writer was the day I said, okay, I'm not a horror writer. I'm a writer who happens to write horror. So to me, that meant I wasn't going to take every idea that I had and shoehorn it into a horror situation. If I just had if I had a story idea, my job as the writer was to make that, to say make that the best story I could is sort of trite, but to do whatever I do, it has to serve that story. I can't try to force it to be something it's not. So that day, I can't tell you when it was exactly, but it was very liberating, and I think my writing just improved tenfold because now I wasn't focused on writing a certain type of story. I was just focused on serving whatever the story was. And if I had never done that, I wouldn't have gotten my agent. My first 2 novels were these sort of quirky mystery novels. It freed me up just to write what I thought was the best story based off that certain idea. So it's kind of funny now that I've returned to horror and I sort of have to, at least contractually, write some horror novels for a few more years, but I'm happy to do so.
Interesting. So it was more of a mindset shift than actual kind of the X's and O's of writing that kind of got you to the next level.
Yeah. I remember there was a writer, again, who was fairly, had a lot more experience than me, and he read a short story that I got published. He's like, wow, this is really great. I almost wish it wasn't a horror story, based on like what had happened. And I just sort of sat, I sort of just filed that away. I don't know. I think I had some ideas for short stories that weren't horror, and I was like just trying to force them in there. And I was like, wait a minute, why am I doing that when I just write what the story is supposed to be? So yeah, to me, that was a really important sort of epiphany.
So how do you decide whether you're going to write a short story or a novel, or do you decide in the beginning, or does the story just kind of germinate and you just kind of let it go and see where it ends up?
Most of the time I sort of know going in if it's going to be a short story or a novel. It's only happened to me once that I started writing something I thought was a short story that sort of blew up into this weird novel. and that was called Swallowing a Donkey's Eye. I mean, that book was obviously by the title is quite strange, but especially now, like I don't get the chance to write as many short stories as I used to. I find them harder to write now because I've been in novel mode for so long.
In what way? Like what's harder to write about it now that you're in novel mode?
Maybe part of that is just sort of the glow of memory, but I used to feel like, I could write a short story fairly quickly. Whether or not it was good, because that was just the memory of me when I first started. Everything was a short story. And when I first started with short stories, they were fairly short. I would say like 3,000 to 5,000. And now, anytime I write a short story, they've gotten longer, almost like 6,000 to 8,000. I mean, so for the novels, I tend to plan them out a little bit before I write them. I mean, that's not the case. So I've written 7. Well, 7 are going to be published. I've written a few more that are safely hidden away that'll never see the light of day. But for some of them, I write like a 10 to 12 page just plot summary. This is what I think is going to happen. Maybe it takes me a month or two to do that. And then I write the book. And the plot summary is nice. It's almost just like having a map. And I give myself permission for things to change. That's fine. But for something like the mystery novels, I feel like my strength as a writer is characters and not plot. So I knew I wasn't good enough to make up the mystery as I went. I kind of had to know what the central mystery of each book was going to be before I got into it. But A Head Full of Ghosts, I didn't write an outline for. That story I feel like I kind of got lucky with. It just sort of fell into my lap. And when I had the idea, it was really almost like eureka. I knew there was going to be 3 parts. I knew what the beginning was. I knew what the end was. I just had to find my way through the middle part. I kept notes as I went, but I didn't write like the big 10-page summary. In some ways, it was kind of fun to write that way because, it felt like you were working without a net a little bit.
That's interesting because it has been your most successful book too. Do you feel like you got to that point where you approach it differently in part because of all the work you've done in the last 15 or 20 years that kind of set you up for that kind of success? Or do you feel like the change in preparation is something you could take to, like the drafts you're working on now?
I think and at that point, I mean, one, it definitely took me my whole writing life to get to the point to write A Head Full of Ghosts. I mean, in a lot of ways, that's my, I don't know, my writer's mission statement is that novel, I think. But I also feel like the one comfort I do have as a writer, I'll call it a comfort. I feel like every story is different, like the idea of serving the story. So I don't get too worked up if like this novel feels different than the other one. I mean, you do feel a little bit, you're always going to feel nervous. If you don't, then I feel like you're probably not growing as a writer. So I still have that nervousness of like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this because it is different than the other one. But there is a measure of comfort in there too. And that's a way to keep it fresh too, honestly, is just the idea that this is going to be different than what you've done previously. Like, I don't want to rewrite the same book every time. So, part of that is a motivation. Just, I want to do something different than I've done previously. I'm taking time away from sleep. I could be watching Netflix instead. The things I could be doing besides writing, since I do have a full-time job. That gives me not so great health insurance. It's a lot of work. So I need motivation sometimes beyond just the story. I mean, the story is most of the motivation, but just the idea that it's going to be a different experience each time, is important to me.
So what's the evolution of the idea or ideas for a story, right? Because you must have a bunch of things that kind of go through your head as like, hey, this could be interesting, or, maybe piecing certain topics together, and maybe this would be, potentially, a good story to go with or a good idea. What is that process like for you? Like, do you take notes during it, and what's the kind of the germination process just from the idea perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I do keep notebooks, and those just tend to be character sketches, or sometimes it's, if I'm going to outline, it's pre-outlining. Because when I outline, I'll actually type it out. So pre-outlining, I'll just be working in my notebooks and trying to figure it out. And I have like 7 of them, but I lose them half the time. So it's kind of fun to be like, when I'm working on a novel, I have that notebook with me, but the other notebooks get lost. And it's kind of fun, like if I find them and I'll flip through it, I'm like, I forgot about that. Random idea. So that's kind of fun. Shoot, what else was I going to say? I just totally derailed myself with the notebooks. Oh, the ideas, right. Again, it's different every time, but I found my focus has been on getting really interested in a set of characters or a character in particular, but also I think taking other people's ideas and pulling them apart and then trying to put them back together. Like The Little Sleep is a clear reference to Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep, and the plot even sort of models The Big Sleep, at least in the beginning. And A Head Full of Ghosts is obviously a riff on, Blatty's The Exorcist, and almost like every other horror thing that's ever been done that gets referenced in the book. Even my most recent novel that I just turned in, I thought to myself, I just had my notebook out and I was just sort of scribbling around for ideas. And at one point I thought, home invasion stories. There are a ton of horror movies of home invasion stories. And I'm generally not a fan of that subgenre. I tend to enjoy more, subtle, quieter kind of stuff as opposed to violent, torture-y things. So I was like, I don't like home invasion stories that kind of really sort of skeeve me out. How would I do one that I would want to sit through? And so that's actually how, for this most recent book that I just finished, that's how that sort of idea just happened. So again, it's fun and frustrating because I feel like you can't go back. As a writer, I don't feel like you can go back to like one thing that you're always going to get something from. But at the same time, I take comfort from that because every story is different. Maybe something's going to appear in a different place that you didn't expect.
And when you're working with an idea that's, in the horror genre, I'm assuming that you must be fully immersed in that story in order to kind of produce a novel out of it. So do you ever feel like it's like too much to have in your head just from like a scary, like I get scared super easy, whether it's a book or a movie, or I can't even watch like Unsolved Mysteries before I go to bed because every single thing I hear in my house is going to like keep me up at night. So I just try to imagine like, all right, imagine like having this in my head for a year. Did you ever get to the point where it's just too much or that's not a big deal?
Well, I am one of the world's biggest scaredy cats. I mean, especially as a kid, like I would send my younger brother upstairs to our bedroom first, like the canary in the coal mine. If he made it upstairs and he was okay, then I could go upstairs. Even like this week, everyone out of the house was gone. It was just me and the dog. And I sort of half joked because it was sort of half true on social media that I was going to have to sleep with the lights on because I was home alone. But my books don't scare me. In fact, I feel like I'm a terrible judge of what I've written is if it's scary or not. I have a sense of, this is sort of disturbing and, there's dread. And to me, scary doesn't always equate to horror. Like I think something can be a horror work without having like, the jump out scare kind of thing. But I don't know, because I think, I know all the gears that are turning. Maybe that's sort of the math part of me is, seeing how everything fits together. So it's hard for me to be like, oh, that's scary. Like when I turned in A Head Full of Ghosts, I had no idea. It's like I felt really good about the book. It's like, wow, I think this is the best thing I've written. I'm excited about it, but I have no idea if people find it scary. One quick story: I turned it into my agent. In the first week he took it out, he got a phone call from an editor at 11:30 at night, and she didn't even say her name. He just picked up the phone and she said, "I just read the tongue scene and I had to hear someone's voice." And then she hung up, and I was like, "Yes, I guess it did scare somebody."
It scared more than just that editor.
Yeah,
I know
sure.
we have the quote right from Stephen King who said you scared the what out of him.
Yeah.
So when you get something like that kind of feedback, like, what is that like?
Oh, I mean, August 21st, 2015.
not that you're keeping track.
No, I mean that's one of the highlights of my professional career was that tweet from Stephen King. I had no idea it was coming. A couple of acquaintances had mentioned they recommended the book to him, so I was kind of hopeful. But the whole summer pretty much passed. It's like, it's not going to happen. And that night I was home. It was hot, and I was moving furniture around. So it was really crabby. And then my phone just started, going crazy. People had seen the tweet before I did. So, I'm not afraid to admit or ashamed to admit that I, got emotional when I saw the tweet. I mean, I started reading because of Stephen King. Never mind, writing. So. Once I saw the tweet, I just sat down. The furniture was away, or I wasn't going to deal with the furniture anymore. I just opened my laptop, took a few cold beverages out of the fridge, and just stayed online and watching my friends react to it. And it was a fun night.
I can imagine. So, I can't even think about having a professional success that you work so hard to get that sort of validation, which kind of brings up the whole point of, as a writer,
it's all downhill from here.
Yeah. Well, what is the benchmark for success, right? I mean, obviously you have short-term goals like, hey,
right.
I want to have a draft that gets done, or I want to make sure that my fifth draft, hopefully this one gets submitted. You have certain short-term goals, and if you want to say what those are, that'd be great. Yeah. But just from a long-term goal and benchmarking success mindset, what are some of the things that you lay out as this would be great if, or this is a dream come true, or I want to at least hit this level?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be lying if I said I didn't dream, like, for each book, like, what would it be like if this was a bestseller, or, if a movie gets made, you think about that stuff, but, you really can't dwell on it too much without driving yourself crazy. I try to really, as much as I can, focus on making something the best book that I can make it. But, certainly with the book that I just finished and just turned in, I hope it does amazingly well. I would love to crack, the New York Times bestsellers list at some point, and, hopefully A Head Full of Ghosts does make its way to the big screen. I know, they're working on it as we speak. So I don't know. It's funny. I tend to look the other direction sometimes just to help me feel not motivated, but like any job, you get bogged down in sort of, daily hiccups or, little disappointments here and there if something doesn't quite go the way you wanted it to. I just think back to, where I was like 10 years ago. It's like, if you were able to talk to the self, if you were to talk to yourself from 10 years ago or 15 years ago and told them where you are right now, that person would just totally be like, what? No way. Again, you try not to, I try to dwell on that too much, but so it can be a good little reminder or kick, like, things are going pretty well. Just try to keep them going in that direction.
And you mentioned earlier that if you keep the idea of, producing a novel in your head, that the length of time that's needed to do that can be overwhelming. So you try to focus kind of day to day. So what does your day to day focus look like? Say the majority of the year is a school day for you. What does that look like in terms of a schedule, and how do you approach it?
So once I'm in like the thick of a novel, I set a daily word count goal of 500 words. If I can get 500 words every day or most days, then I'm feeling good, because it is a marathon, not a sprint. And I tend to break it down because I'm a math guy. I'll break it down 500 words a day, 3,000 a week, and 10 to 12,000 a month. So obviously 500 a day. If I did 500 a day every day, that would be 18,000 a month. But I'm realistic. I give myself permission to miss the 500 word count, for various reasons. If I only got 200 that day, it wasn't working great, then that's okay. I'll just get them the next day. So I think it's important to set goals, like the mini goals, but not beat yourself up too much if you don't make them. And I like having the monthly goal, because I always make the monthly goal, even though if I miss daily goals here and there. Again, just little games just to keep you motivated and not beating yourself up too much, because you're a writer. You're going to beat yourself up the whole time anyway. Like, this isn't any good. It's the ego of the writer that you try to manage.
So how many words is in a novel?
So, I tend to write short novels. So A Head Full of Ghosts, for example, is 84,000 words. I don't know, George R.R. Martin's are probably a couple 100,000. Those are like the real door stoppers. But, most novels these days are probably between 80 and like 110, unless you go to like, 400 or 500 plus pages.
Right. So I cut you off. All right. So yours are around 80, 90,000. Yeah. You're trying to produce 10 to 15,000 words per month.
Right.
All right. And then, so what? Until you're at about 6 months to produce a first draft? Is that usually how it works? Or?
Yeah. Again, each book can be different. Like A Head Full of Ghosts, I started it in February of 2013, finished early December. So it was like 9 months almost. My more recent books have taken me a little bit more than a year, but that's also because some things have just gotten spread out by, I would take like a couple months off because I had other commitments to deal with. But yeah, everything, again, I keep repeating myself. Sorry about that. But, every story is different. I just try to approach it that way. Now, obviously, if I have, I just whacked the filter.
I do it all the time. Anyone who listens to these podcasts hears random noises at some point.
I'm not banging my fist on the table like Khrushchev or Shu. Obviously, now that I have contract deadlines to deal with, I try to schedule or at least, work out when I'll be able to finish such and such by a certain point of time. Like I have a short story collection due next summer, and then a novel due the following summer, which, I have no idea what it's going to be yet. But the short story collection is essentially done. I only have to write a couple of stories. So in my long-term planning, I'm like, okay, I'll get those stories done. And the rest of this year would be maybe writing other stories for people and figuring out what the next novel is. So, that's about as long-term planning planning as I go.
Now, do you ever picture who you're writing for? Is there like an ideal reader for a certain work that you're producing?
No, it's me. Me first. I mean, if I'm gonna take time away from my life, and I try not to take time away from the kids. I usually do writing when they're doing their own thing, or at night when they're in bed, or if I'm lucky enough to have a few free periods in school, especially in the spring. I get some stuff done then as well. It has to be something that I would want to read first. I've been lucky that so far the things that I want to read, other people have wanted to read as well. So.
Right. And you mentioned before, and I loved it. You said, if you're in it for instant gratification,
right,
writing is not for you. And at the same time, I can't think of a profession that wouldn't follow that role. If you're talking, about, high level success. So what other advice, or if you want to expand on that too, would you give to, say, like we're at Providence College right now, right? It's a Providence College podcast. You're an alum. If you're talking to a group of students or class of kids who are considering entering this field, either full time or part time,
right?
What are some of the other things you would tell them?
Don't do it. No, I'm just kidding. Well, I think if you're going to be a writer, you have to read and read a lot and read widely. You just can't read. If you're interested in science fiction, yes, read science fiction, but you should also read outside the genre. It'll only help your writing. I think finding your group or finding a group, whether it's an online group or even locally, for a few years, I had myself and some friends would meet at the Trinity Brew Pub downtown Providence once a month. We just discuss the stories that we wrote and critique them. Because even if you find that the feedback isn't great, just having the social interaction with other writers, it does recharge the batteries. I tend to go to 2 or 3 writers' conventions a year as well, and that's really the main thrust for me for those conventions. Is just being around other writers tends to, revitalize me if I'm feeling tired or, because most of the day I'm not around other writers and people who don't necessarily understand what it is you're trying to do. Especially if you get a day from like a coworker who says, "Hey, your hobby's working out great, isn't it?" Yes, my hobby. So it's nice. It's restorative to be around other writers. So read, find your group, but at the same time, you have to be careful about getting sucked into too much time online and social media. I think for writers, that's a real hurdle these days because in one way you have to be on pretty much to promote and network, but at the same time, that can just take up all of your writing time. Not only take up all your writing time, but also make it feel like, oh, if I don't have something out now, I'm not a success. I think social media is really making it harder and harder for writers to be patient. It's hard not to feel that way because you'll see all these other writers who've got stuff coming out, and then you're like, oh, like even me, like when I've had books out almost like one a year, you read about other people who have books. I'm like, oh man, I don't have anything out right now, and you start getting anxious, and you're just like, all right, just relax. It's
right. You're not James Patterson putting one out every 2 months. Well, that's a great point about social media, and I was going to ask you about that too because I feel like it's a multi-layered platform for someone in your position, right? Because you have the people who can create their social media following and then produce something not after the fact, but once they have that that tribe of people, so to speak, and then they'll consume it, as opposed to someone who like maybe produces it first and then tries to cultivate the audience on social media after the fact or concurrently, I guess. So for you, how does that work, and what's your connection to fans? Like you see some people who are maybe more journalists or someone who has like a column at like theringer.com or like someone like Shea Serrano who I feel like is on Twitter 24/7 and producing like kind of really creative work in kind of in a column 2 or 3 times a week online. So you have a lot of different ways of approaching it. So how do you approach it, and what's kind of like the best case scenario if you had to really do it well? Right.
Well, so for me, I feel like it's been like a slow accruing of followers over years. With the biggest bump coming, since A Head Full of Ghosts has come out. But that's sort of the other frustrating and fun thing about writing is there's just so many different ways, so many different paths. It's hard to say there's one correct thing to do because every time you say that, no, I mean, this person did the total opposite thing and they did fine. I would say if you can get a foot into nonfiction, freelance writing, as a way to, if not supplement or just to build your, I hate to say the word brand, but start building your career. I think that's certainly a good way to go because, it's very hard to make a living as a fiction writer. I mean, I don't currently make a living as a fiction writer. I mean, it certainly supplements it. I mean, I suppose I could, if I didn't already have kids about to go into college and a house and all that stuff, I certainly could make a living off of writing, but it's hard just to make a living off of writing fiction.
Right. And then do you ever have either the pressure or the curiosity to enter, whether it's doing screenwriting and things along those lines where it's similar to what you're currently doing, but kind of an offshoot in terms of a platform or format?
Yeah, I would like to try it. One of the hurdles is I feel like I've just sort of figured out how to write a good novel. The screenplay is a different medium. I feel like it would be a little bit arrogant of me just think, I could just go and write a screenplay. No, I mean, I'd have to learn the form and stuff like that. But sure, I definitely, I wrote 1 years ago and it was terrible. But yeah, I think maybe those opportunities might be there at some point down the road if things continue to go well. And I certainly wouldn't mind having a shot at it.
Right. Well, thank you so much for coming in. This is great. I feel like I talked to you for hours about this. This is so interesting. If people do want to follow you online, what's the best way for them to do so?
So on Twitter, I am at Paul G. Tremblay. I have a Facebook author page too. No G, Paul Tremblay. Because Twitter, someone else said Paul Tremblay. I don't know. There's a strongman, or is it CrossFit competitor named Paul Tremblay? It's funny. His name comes up. I actually got this random invite from a guy in Iceland. It's like, hey, you coming out? We'll fly you out for August something, for this big, strongman festival. It's like, oh man, that'd be hilarious if I showed up. But I was like, no, we can't do it.
See, that should be a short story, Paul.
Yeah.
You say get a foothold in nonfiction like that. You taking that invite and running with it would have been great.
Yeah, the other tweet that came up, someone found it. This guy won the squatting competition, so I'll PG it. But the tweet was Paul Tremblay, buttocks man, buttocks king, because he had won the squat competition. I was like, no, that's not me.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's great. Well, like I said, thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully, anyone out there listening to this picks up a book or two, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you, Matt. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.